Imagine living in a country where the war is finally over, but the fear never really left. The guns have gone silent, the soldiers have returned home, and on paper, everything looks like peace. But if you were actually there, walking through the towns and villages of the American South in 1865, you wouldn't feel peace at all. You'd feel tension. You'd feel uncertainty. And most of all, you'd feel like something dangerous was quietly building beneath the surface. The Civil War had just ended. After 4 long years of brutal fighting, the Union had won, and slavery had officially been abolished. For millions of Black Americans, this moment was supposed to mark the beginning of a new life. For the first time, they were free. They could choose where to live, they could work for wages, they could build families without fear of being separated. And perhaps most importantly, they were beginning to gain the right to vote. It was a powerful, life-changing shift, but freedom written in law is very different from freedom in reality. Because even though the system had changed overnight, people's beliefs had not. In the South, many former Confederates were struggling to accept this new world. They had lost the war, lost their wealth, and now it felt like they were losing control over society itself. The idea that Black citizens could vote, hold office, or stand as equals was something they simply could not accept. And when fear mixes with anger, it rarely stays quiet. In 1866, in a small town in Tennessee, a group of former Confederate soldiers came together and created something that, at first, didn't seem very serious. They formed a secret club and gave it a strange name, the Ku Klux Klan. In the beginning, it was almost like a social group. They wore odd costumes, rode horses at night, and treated it like a kind of game. But that game didn't stay harmless for long. Very quickly, it turned into something far more dangerous. The costumes became symbols of terror, the nighttime rides became organized missions, and the Klan began targeting people, not randomly, but very specifically. They went after Black citizens who were trying to exercise their new rights. They targeted teachers who were educating Black children. They threatened and attacked white Americans who supported equality or worked with Reconstruction governments. And they didn't just threaten people, they used violence in ways meant to send a message. Homes were burned, people were dragged out into the night and beat. Some were killed without warning. And almost all of it happened in darkness when there were no witnesses, no protection, and no way to fight back. But what made the Klan especially powerful wasn't just the violence. It was the fear they created. They wanted people to believe they were something more than human. They spread stories that they were ghosts of fallen soldiers, spirits that couldn't be stopped. Dressed in white robes, appearing suddenly in the night, they created an image that felt almost supernatural. And for many people, especially those already living in fear, it worked. Because fear has a way of controlling behavior. It keeps people from speaking out, it keeps them from voting, it keeps them from organizing or resisting. And slowly, across parts of the South, the Klan began to take control without ever officially holding power. In some areas, they influenced elections through intimidation. Black voters were threatened or attacked if they tried to vote. Local officials were warned to stay silent. And in many cases, the people who were supposed to enforce the law either couldn't do anything or simply chose not to. Sometimes they were afraid. Sometimes they agreed with what was happening. And sometimes they were part of the Klan themselves. As all of this was happening, reports began reaching the federal government. At first, they were scattered. Stories from different towns, different states, but over time, a pattern became clear. This wasn't isolated violence. This was organized, it was systematic, and it was spreading. By the late 1860s, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Entire communities were living in fear. Citizens were being attacked simply for exercising rights that the Constitution now guaranteed. And the question began to grow louder in Washington. If the government cannot protect its own people, then what does freedom really mean? At first, the response was cautious. New laws were passed. Reconstruction governments were supported. Federal troops were stationed in some areas, but not enough to make a real difference everywhere. And the Klan adapted. They stayed hidden. They struck quickly and disappeared before anyone could respond. It was like trying to fight something you couldn't fully see. But the violence didn't slow down. If anything, it grew worse. More attacks, more intimidation, more lives destroyed, and eventually the situation reached a breaking point. By 1870, the federal government realized that this was no longer just a political problem. This was a direct threat to the nation itself. A secret organization was using terror to control large parts of the country and undermine the rights that had just been fought for in a bloody war. So the government made a decision, not a small one. Not a symbolic one, but a real, powerful decision. They were going to fight back. Congress passed a series of laws known as the Enforcement Acts. These laws gave the federal government new authority to step in when citizens' rights were being violated. It meant that federal troops could be used more aggressively. It meant that local authorities could be overridden if they failed to act. And most importantly, it meant that groups like the Klan could be targeted as organized criminal conspiracies. Then in 1871, things went even further. A new law was passed that would become known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. This law gave the president extraordinary powers. In certain areas, habeas corpus could be suspended. Suspected members of the Klan could be arrested and detained, and military force could be used directly against them. This was serious. The government was now willing to take extreme measures to stop the violence. That's how dangerous the situation had become, and then came the moment that changed everything. Federal troops were deployed across the South in a more coordinated and aggressive way, but this time they weren't just there as a presence, they were there to act. They patrolled towns, guarded polling places, and responded quickly to reports of violence. For many Black Americans, this was the first time they felt something close to real protection. But the real turning point didn't happen in broad daylight. It happened at night, because the government realized something important. You can't defeat a secret organization by only working in the open, so they began to operate in the shadows as well. Federal forces and U.S. Marshals started conducting night raids. They gathered intelligence, tracked suspects, and moved quietly through areas known for Klan activity. Homes were surrounded without warning, doors were forced open. Men who had once hidden behind masks and terrorized others in the dark were suddenly the ones being dragged out into the light. And as arrests began, something unexpected happened. The Klan started to break from within, because once members were captured, many of them began to talk. They revealed names, meeting places, and plans. What once seemed like a powerful, invisible force began to look more like a fragile network of individuals trying to stay hidden. Hundreds of arrests quickly turned into thousands. Trials were held in federal courts, and for the first time, many of these men faced real consequences. Some were fined, some were sent to prison. And many simply disappeared from the movement altogether. The fear that had once controlled entire communities began to shift. Now it was the Klan members who were afraid. Every knock on the door could mean arrest. Every neighbor could be an informant. The secrecy that had once protected them was now working against them. By the end of 1871, the change was clear. Klan activity dropped sharply in many regions. Entire groups collapsed. Leaders fled or went into hiding. The organization that once seemed unstoppable was falling apart. But here's the part most people don't think about. The Klan didn't disappear because its ideas vanished. It didn't collapse because people suddenly changed their beliefs. It collapsed because, for a brief moment in time, the government chose to act with full force and enforce the law without hesitation. And when it did, it worked. But history doesn't end in a single moment, because even as the Klan was being crushed, a new question was quietly forming in the background. What happens when the soldiers leave? What happens when the attention fades? What happens when the government stops pushing back? Because power, once challenged, doesn't always stay gone, and the story is far from over. After 1871, it looked like something incredible had just happened. For the first time since the end of the Civil War, people in many parts of the South could finally breathe again. The night felt quieter. The constant fear that used to hang in the air started to fade, at least a little. In places where the Ku Klux Klan once moved freely, spreading terror without consequence, there was now hesitation, silence, even disappearance. But if you looked closely, you'd realize something important. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just a pause, because the thing that crushed the Klan wasn't just arrests or laws. It was pressure, constant, overwhelming pressure from the federal government, troops on the ground, investigations, night raids, trials, fear shifting from victims to perpetrators. And pressure like that only works as long as it's maintained. The moment it weakens, everything can start to change again. At first, though, it really did seem like a victory. Federal authorities continued making arrests. Court cases kept moving forward. In some regions, entire Klan networks were dismantled. Leaders who once operated with confidence either fled or went into hiding. Ordinary members, realizing the risk was now too high, quietly stepped away. Communities that had been paralyzed by fear slowly began to rebuild. Black voters returned to polling places. Schools reopened. Local governments, at least for a while, started functioning without constant intimidation. It felt like progress, real, visible progress, but behind the scenes, something else was happening. In Washington, priorities were beginning to shift. The country had been dealing with Reconstruction for years now. It was expensive, politically complicated, and deeply controversial. Not everyone supported the federal government's heavy involvement in the South. In fact, many Americans, especially in the North, were growing tired of it. To them, the war was over, slavery was gone. And they believed it was time to move on. But moving on meant something very different depending on who you were. For those living under the threat of violence, it meant losing protection. For politicians, it meant pulling back, and slowly, almost quietly, that's exactly what began to happen. Federal troops started to withdraw from certain areas. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. The presence that once kept the Klan in check began to shrink, investigations slowed, enforcement became less aggressive. Attention shifted to other national issues, and as that pressure faded, something else returned. At first, it was subtle, small groups meeting again in secret, whispers spreading through communities. Old networks reconnecting, not as openly as before, not as boldly, but they were still there. Because the truth was, while the Klan as an organization had been crushed, the ideas behind it had never disappeared. They had simply gone quiet, waiting, watching. And as the federal government stepped back, those ideas began to find space again. Violence didn't immediately return to the same level, but intimidation did. Quiet threats, economic pressure. Social control, systems that didn't always rely on masks and midnight raids, but were just as effective in limiting freedom. Laws began to change too. Local governments, now with less federal oversight, started passing new rules that restricted voting. Not openly, not in a way that said this group cannot vote, but in ways that made it harder. Complicated requirements, barriers that targeted specific communities without saying so directly. It was a different kind of control, less visible, but still powerful. And over time, it started to undo much of the progress that had been made. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction itself was losing support. Political compromises were being made. Deals were struck behind closed doors, and in 1877, one decision would quietly change everything. The remaining federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Just like that, the era of strong federal enforcement came to an end, and with it, the protection that had once kept groups like the Klan in check. Now you might expect that the Klan would immediately rise again, just as powerful as before. But history doesn't always repeat itself in the same way. Instead, what happened was more complicated. The original Klan, the one that had been crushed in the early 1870s, never fully returned in the exact same form. But the conditions that allowed it to exist, those conditions came back. And over time, new groups, new systems, and new forms of control took its place. Because when fear is no longer challenged, it finds new ways to grow. What makes this moment in history so important isn't just that the Klan was defeated, it's how it was defeated. For a brief period, the federal government made a clear choice. It decided that protecting citizens' rights was worth using its full power. It enforced the law consistently. It didn't look away, and it treated domestic terror as a real threat. And the result? It worked. An organization that once controlled entire regions through fear was dismantled in a relatively short time. But the second lesson is just as important. When that commitment faded, when enforcement weakened, when attention shifted, the progress didn't hold, because rights don't protect themselves, they depend on action. They depend on people being willing to enforce them, defend them, and stand behind them even when it's difficult. And that's the part of the story that often gets forgotten. People remember that the Klan existed, some know that it was violent, fewer know that it was actually crushed at one point, but almost no one talks about what happened after. About how something can be defeated and still find a way to return in a different form. About how silence and inaction can slowly undo even the strongest victories. And maybe the most uncomfortable question of all is this: if the same situation happened again, would the response be the same? Would there be the same level of urgency, the same willingness to act? The same refusal to ignore what's happening, or would it once again take years of suffering before something is done? Because history doesn't just tell us what happened, it shows us what's possible. It shows us that even something as powerful and terrifying as the Klan could be brought down, but it also shows us how fragile that victory can be. How easily it can slip away when people start to believe the problem has already been solved. And that's what makes this story more than just history, it's a reminder that what was destroyed once can always come back if no one is paying attention. For a moment in history, something almost unbelievable had happened. A secret organization that ruled through fear had been taken down. Not slowly, not symbolically, but directly. The government stepped in, used its full power, and forced it to collapse. People who once felt untouchable were arrested. Networks that once operated in the shadows were exposed. And entire communities, for the first time, felt what safety could actually look like. But if you've been following closely, you already know that wasn't the end, because history doesn't always repeat itself the same way. Sometimes it changes shape. After the federal government pulled back in the late 1870s, the South didn't suddenly become peaceful or equal. It became quieter, and that quietness can be misleading. Because instead of loud, visible terror, a different kind of control began to take over. One that didn't always need masks or midnight rides. It worked through systems. Through laws that didn't openly say what they were doing but achieved the same result. Voting became harder, not impossible on paper but difficult in practice. Requirements were introduced that seemed neutral but were designed to exclude. Over time, fewer and fewer black citizens were able to participate in elections, not because they didn't want to, but because the system made it nearly impossible. And when people lose their voice in a system, everything else becomes easier to control. At the same time, social pressure grew stronger. Communities were divided more sharply. Opportunities became limited, and violence, while less organized in the way the early Klan operated, never truly disappeared. It just became less visible to those who weren't directly affected. The original Klan had been crushed, yes, but the environment that allowed it to exist had quietly returned, and then, decades later, something surprising happened. In the early 20th century, the Ku Klux Klan came back. Not exactly the same as before, but recognizable. It rebranded itself. It presented itself differently, trying to appear more like a national movement rather than a secret terror group. And for a time, it grew again, spreading beyond the South, gaining members, influencing politics. That alone tells you something important. Defeating an organization is one thing. Eliminating the ideas behind it is something else entirely. Because ideas don't disappear just because a group is shut down. They don't vanish because of arrests or laws. They go quiet. They adapt. They wait for the right moment to return, and that's exactly what happened. But here's where the story becomes even more important. Because if you go back and look at that moment in the early 1870s, the moment when soldiers were sent in, when the government decided to act, you'll notice something rare. For once, the system worked the way it was supposed to. The laws that had been written were actually enforced. The rights that had been promised were actually defended. And the people who were being targeted were, for a time, actually protected. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people in power choose to act. They choose not to ignore what's happening. They choose not to delay. They choose not to look the other way. And when that choice is made clearly and consistently, even something as powerful as the Klan can be stopped. But when that choice fades, so does the protection. That's the pattern you see in this story, not just once but multiple times. Action leads to change. Inaction allows things to return, and the scary part is how quickly that shift can happen. One decade, a group is completely dismantled. A few years later, the same ideas are finding new ways to spread. It doesn't take centuries. Sometimes it doesn't even take a generation. And that leads to a bigger question, one that goes beyond this specific moment in history. What actually keeps a society stable? Is it laws written on paper? Or is it the willingness to enforce those laws even when it's difficult, even when it's unpopular, even when it requires real effort? Because if this story shows anything, it's that laws alone are not enough. You can pass the strongest laws in the world. You can declare rights and freedoms. But if no one is there to protect those rights when they're challenged, then those rights become fragile, temporary, conditional, and that's exactly what happened after Reconstruction ended. The protections faded, and with them, much of the progress that had been made. For many people, the promise of freedom remained just that, a promise, not a reality. And yet, despite all of this, that moment in the early 1870s still stands out, because it proves something. It proves that even in a time of deep division, even after a brutal war, even in the face of organized terror, change is possible. Not easy, not permanent, but possible. And maybe that's why this story still matters today, not because it's comfortable, not because it has a perfect ending, but because it shows both sides of what a society can do. It shows what happens when people act, and it shows what happens when they stop. So when you hear about groups that seem too powerful to challenge, or systems that feel too deeply rooted to change, remember this moment. There was a time when the Ku Klux Klan controlled entire regions through fear, and there was also a time when that power was broken, not by accident, not by luck, but by a decision. A decision to act, to enforce, and to refuse to accept that terror was just the way things had to be, and in the end, that decision made all the difference, but it also left behind a warning. That victories like this don't last on their own. They have to be maintained, protected, and sometimes fought for again, because history doesn't just remember what happened. If you step back and look at the entire story, it almost feels unreal. A nation fights a brutal war to end slavery. Millions of people are suddenly given freedom. A secret organization rises in the shadows to take that freedom away, and then, for a brief moment, the full power of the government comes down and crushes it. It sounds like a complete story. A beginning, a middle, and an end, but real history doesn't work like that, because the most important part of this story isn't just what happened, it's what didn't last. When the Ku Klux Klan was first destroyed in the early 1870s, it proved something very clear. It proved that even a deeply rooted, highly organized group built on fear could be dismantled when there is enough will to do it. It showed that laws are not just words if they are actually enforced. It showed that protection isn't an idea, it's an action. And for a moment, that action changed everything. People who had been living in constant fear started to feel something new. Not complete safety, not perfect equality, but a sense that the system might actually defend them. That if something went wrong, someone would step in. That the violence didn't have to be accepted as normal. That feeling matters more than most people realize, because once people believe they are protected, they begin to participate. They vote. They speak, they build, they invest in their communities. They start to believe in the future. But when that protection disappears, everything begins to shrink again. That's exactly what happened after Reconstruction faded. The soldiers left, the enforcement weakened, the attention shifted elsewhere. And slowly, almost quietly, the space that had once been cleared began to fill again. Not always with the same faces, not always with the same methods, but with the same underlying force, control through fear, pressure, and exclusion. And that's the part of the story that often gets ignored. People like clear endings. They like to believe that once something bad is defeated, it stays gone. That once justice is served, it becomes permanent. But history shows something different. It shows that progress is not a straight line. It moves forward and then it can move backward. It grows stronger and then it can weaken. And sometimes the only thing that determines which direction it goes is whether people continue to pay attention. Because the truth is, the Klan wasn't just a group, it was a reaction to change, a reaction to losing power, a reaction to a new idea of equality that some people refuse to accept. And reactions like that don't disappear easily. They evolve, they find new ways to express themselves. Sometimes they're loud and visible, like they were in the 1860s. Sometimes they're quiet and built into systems, harder to see but just as real. And that's why this story doesn't stay in the past. It keeps coming back in different forms. Not always in the same way, not always with the same names, but with the same core tension. Who has power, who gets protection, and who decides what justice looks like. If you think about it, the most powerful moment in this entire story isn't the rise of the Klan. It's not even the violence. It's that turning point when the government made a decision. A decision to stop waiting, a decision to stop hoping the problem would fix itself, a decision to act because that's the moment everything changed. And it raises a question that doesn't belong to the past, it belongs to every generation that comes after. What do you do when something is clearly wrong, but fixing it requires effort, risk, and commitment? Do you act immediately, or do you wait, hoping it will fade on its own? Because in this story, waiting made things worse. Ignoring the problem allowed it to grow, and only when action was taken did things begin to change. But even then, the lesson didn't end there. Because action once wasn't enough, it had to be continued, maintained, protected over time, and when that didn't happen, the progress that had been made began to slip away. That's the uncomfortable truth at the center of all of this. There are moments in history where everything seems to come together. Where the right decision is made, where the right action is taken, and where real change happens. But those moments don't guarantee the future, they only create the possibility of it. What happens next depends on whether that same level of attention, effort, and commitment continues, or whether people start to believe that the job is already finished. Because the moment people believe that is often the moment things begin to reverse. So when you look back at this story, the rise of fear, the response of power, the brief victory, and the slow return of old patterns, it stops being just a historical event. It becomes a cycle. A pattern that can repeat in different ways in different times, under different names. And maybe that's why this story matters more than it first appears. Not because it gives a simple lesson, but because it gives a complicated one. It shows that even the strongest actions can fade, that even the biggest victories can be temporary. And that the difference between progress and regression is often not dramatic. It's gradual, quiet, and easy to miss until it's already happening. In the end, the day soldiers destroyed the Klan's power was real. It happened. It changed lives. It proved what was possible. But what came after proved something just as important. That what is built can be undone. That what is protected can be left unprotected. And that history is not just shaped by big moments, but by what people choose to do after those moments have passed. And maybe the most important question of all isn't what happened back then. It's what happens next, every time a society is faced with the same kind of choice again.